Final Fight! Final Fight! Final Fight! Final Fight! Final Fight!
Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game SO. Today I got a brand new retrospective starting for you guys today because we're going to be reviewing all of the mainline Final Fight games, starting with the arcade original obviously. And when I say this is still one of the best arcade beat 'em up games of all time and one of the most successful arcade beat 'em ups ever made, I 100% mean it. This game took the world by storm, first in the arcades and then on the Super Nintendo, and we've been playing it ever since. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But what can you say about Final Fight? This game is just absolutely a Hall of Fame level good arcade game that pretty much everyone has played at least once. Whether you saw an arcade cabinet or played it on the Super Nintendo, I'm sure there's not a single person in the comments that are going to say they've never played this title at least once. And obviously in a retrospective fashion, we're just going to be talking about the arcade version here, not the two Super Nintendo ports or the Sega CD version. They are great, but in a retrospective, I always like taking a look at the best game as far as ports are concerned. And this basically started life out as a sequel to Street Fighter, and it was supposed to be a fighting game, but both the genre and the title were pivoted over, giving you what you obviously see today as a beat 'em up game. And I remember first seeing this game in arcades as a kid. I absolutely fell in love with it. I had the Sega CD port and played the ever-loving crap out of it. This is just the type of game that really shows that lightning can strike twice for a company. You have Street Fighter and you have Final Fight coming out of Capcom, and they were really on a hot streak here, maybe only challenged by Sega as far as arcade dominance is concerned. And even though characters like Damned here are just going to continue to show up in stuff like Final Fight Revenge, which is a fighting game that we'll be talking about later on in the series. What I'm mostly surprised about is just how synonymous this game is with arcades. There are 5 Final Fight games and only 2 of them actually saw arcade releases, the original as well as Final Fight Revenge on the Sega Saturn and Sega Titan video, and that's how impactful this first title was. People still think of Final Fight as being an arcade franchise, even though Final Fight 2 and 3 never actually came out on any arcade board. They were Super Nintendo originals, and I would have loved to have seen a Capcom CPS 2 entry into this franchise. Maybe Final Fight 2 on the CPS 2 would have been really fun to see, but it makes total sense because the Super Nintendo was just dominating the sales charts both in North America as well as in Japan, so it does totally track why you only ever saw one arcade release. As we get into the train here in Metro City, you can just tell how bad things really are. I would say the #1 most effective thing outside of the amazing beat 'em up combat is just the world building on this game. All of those strap hangers just basically swinging in the breeze there. You can see the momentum as the train goes through the track with those lights on the side. It really does feel like a living, breathing universe. Metro City is a place. Clearly things have gone bad, and this is the first instance of Mike Hagar in a video game, and I do consider him to be one of the best characters ever created. Honestly, it's just one of those things. Mike Hagar's design, his personality, how he plays a role in so many different Capcom games, it just 100% hit the minute I played it, and it hits every single time I play it since. But we honestly, in a retrospective fashion, have to look at the game not just as when it released, but from a modern lens. And I will say that all of the graphics here still 100% hold up incredibly well. The Capcom CPS boards had some great graphical prowess. They were better than anything that existed on the home market for 2D, so this game today is still absolutely gorgeous to look at in motion. The sprites, the background layers, the animations, it is just a 10 out of 10 pretty looking game, and I would say this compared to Street Fighter 2, I like the look and art style of Final Fight so much better. These colorways here, those purples that are almost neon, all of the different signage, that red in the brick, it just looks absolutely incredible, and the graphics haven't aged a day. Honestly, 2D sprites age so much better than early 3D. There really isn't anything about this game I would say needs any sort of upscaling or improvement. Secondarily, the combat is just absolutely iconic. All of the different combos, the special moves, the jumping attacks, it hits, pun very much intended, the same way today as it did back in its year of release. And of course the soundtrack, these are some of the most iconic tracks in video game history, especially with Andore right in the back there, a Andre the Giant facsimile. Such classic characters and such classic music. Go ahead and listen for 45 seconds and I'll be right back. I mean, honestly, every last bit of music in Final Fight is just a 10 out of 10. They're iconic tracks, and there's still tracks when you hear them today. You have that nostalgia for seeing them in the arcade the first time, or maybe even on the Super Nintendo, where they sounded slightly different, but still had that same vibe going on. And getting kidnapped here to fight two different Andoris in this underground fighting pit under a bar, it's just such a weird thing, but it 100% works. Like every Final Fight game, you can totally cheese it a little bit too. If you get the Andoris staggered up together, you can basically just either wail away with them on the pipe and stun lock them, or you can do jump kicks. There's a lot of different ways to cheese Final Fight, and finding those ways is half the fun. Or this boss battle right here against Eddie E. The gigantic moon in the background, the silhouette of the skyline of Metro City, all of these different people cheering the fight on. This is just so filled with detail. You want to look at every single square inch of the screen. Now as we move on to the next level, let's talk about how this game has aged. Again, like I said, graphically, mechanically, as well as music-wise, I think it's every bit as good as the day it came out. But when you get to the back half of the game, a little bit of cheapness will come in. This was definitely designed to make sure you contributed as many quarters as you could before you saw the ending or finally gave up, and this game can definitely be a little bit cheap feeling in spots. It's not that I don't love the game, it's not that I'm trying to find something to critique, just every once in a while you end up taking a life or two off, and it feels like you basically just got stun locked, because you can definitely get juggled in this game, just like you can basically cheese your enemies, and it is going to put you in a situation where you unduly lose a life and have to throw another credit in, because you never actually were able to get input back on your character. But that makes total sense. These games were designed to make sure they made enough quarters, so you have to have a little bit of cheapness in there so the game isn't a cakewalk, and obviously from a gameplay perspective you don't want to beat them up that's too easy. So I would say as far as the fear factor on Final Fight, it's like an 8 out of 10. It can sometimes be a tiny bit cheap, but overall you can definitely learn to live with it. Now moving on to even further levels, Final Fight definitely qualifies for a proper beat 'em up because it does have an elevator level, and I think that every beat 'em up has to have at least one, and this was the first time I ever actually saw an elevator in a beat 'em up game in arcades. So my entire theory on elevators and beat 'em ups starts here with Final Fight. Now the Relento fight, especially in later stages, will drive you absolutely nuts. Actually trying to grab hold of him and grapple him or attack him is going to be a metric crap ton of challenge, maybe in a slightly unfair way. Now as we get to stage 4 and stage 5, again, the combat is spectacular, the graphics are outstanding, but this is where the game feels like maybe ever so slightly it's trying to artificially lengthen itself. You're going to be scrolling the stage for a while, you're going to be fighting a lot of dudes, and it is still fun, but it can feel a little bit lengthened. And I do love this sketchy bathroom scene here as well. You know full well that at least one of those stalls has a hole through the wall in it. That's all I'm going to say on that topic for sure. But the graphics and the world building here are second to none because obviously Mike Hagar is the mayor of Metro City, and you can tell from the overall state of decay, it is trying to be New York City from the late 70s and early 80s where everything was grimy and gritty and crime was basically running rampant with graffiti all over the subways. And I would say this is definitely taking inspiration from action movies as well. If I had to put one movie to this more so than any other, it would be the Death Wish franchise with Charles Bronson. Metro City's always felt like New York City in that film, and obviously we're just throwing punches here and sometimes using a sword, not using firearms, but it still does make sense that this is basically Death Wish the game without all that hyper violence. But hey, if Capcom wants to make a Final Fight 4 and basically set it in the world of Death Wish and make Charles Bronson a playable character, I would be buying that day one. I'd buy 2 copies just to support it. But as we move on, again, we do need to take this in a historical lens as well as in a modern perspective. These are the levels that are absolutely fun to play, the graphics are great, but they throw every single enemy at you and they make you fight them over and over again. And while all of the sprites are iconic, all of the characters here continue to be used in Capcom games, this is where, at least from a modern perspective, if you played the game recently enough, it feels like maybe it starts to drag a tiny bit. But let's talk about which game is actually the best game in my opinion in the Final Fight franchise, because we have 4 more videos coming up and it's a little bit strange to say, but I still think that the original game is the best. Final Fight is never as good as it was in the original. That's not to say Final Fight 2 and 3 aren't incredible games, they absolutely are, but for my money the original did it the best and it still continues to be the best game of the franchise. Leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think. We're going to do one more soundtrack sample because this next track every bit as good as the first one you listened to, and I'll come back, show you how the game ends, we'll close it out. Enjoy! I mean, absolutely outstanding music, but if we take the original Final Fight as a whole and kind of compare it to the rest of the franchise, to me what the most interesting thing is just how few games there are for how big of an impact this title actually had. Final Fight will get mentioned in the same breath as something like Street Fighter, Sonic the Hedgehog, Super Mario, for those franchises that are just iconic that absolutely everybody knows. But there's only 5 games in the mainline series. One of them is a 3D fighting game and the other is a 3D beat 'em up on PlayStation 2, and that's going to be a weird episode when we talk about that one. But the original Final Fight just basically captured gamers' imagination in arcades, and it did absolutely everything right. Incredible graphics that were better than we saw at home, a soundtrack that could not be beaten, and obviously gameplay elements that are just incredible. And bonus points for the leader of the gang taking a Hans Gruber off the Nakatomi Tower and falling to his death. Obviously this is not a die-hard beat 'em up, but the ending at least feels a little die-hard to me, and if I can equate anything to that movie, you know I'm going to give it bonus points. But Final Fight was just an absolute success from the beginning. It sold tens of thousands of arcade cabinets, and those were big numbers back in the day, and it sold over 2 million different versions of the home console port, and Capcom just hit a home run the first time out with Final Fight, and I don't think it ever got as good as the original. But you tell me your favorite Final Fight game down below, and I'll definitely chat with you guys. But short of that, we're done, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.